thank you for joining me for APIs Revisited, and thank you to digital leaders for allowing us to be part of this exciting week of events. My name's Claire Cox and I'm part of the team at Scott Logic that will be here encouraging you to look again at APIs and the transformative role that they could play at your organisation. I'll be joined by a different speaker at the same time every day this week for Appy Hour, which is very easy for me to say with my Yorkshire accent. And if you haven't already signed up for the other Appy Hours that will be taking place this week, I'll put a link in the chat box where you'll be able to view the whole schedule and book your place for the other sessions. Now, today I'm delighted to be joined by Scott Logic's Innovation Director, Graham Odds, who will be discussing the oft-untapped business potential of APIs. If you have a question for Graham, pop it into the question box and we'll take as many as we can at the end. And if you don't already have a copy of Graham's white paper on the same subject, you can download it by clicking the same URL in the chat box or by filling in your survey at the end. Now, whilst we're on the subject of surveys, we have the opportunity today to raise money for a charity that is very close to our hearts during this webinar. But don't worry, we are not asking you to dig deep. Instead, Scott Logic will be donating £5 to the Altitude Foundation for every completed 60-second survey that we'll ask you to fill out at the end of the webinar. I'll give you more information about how to access the survey and tell you a bit about the charity after Graham's presentation. And we'll be able to see just how much money we've raised as a result of today's event. So now let me introduce you to today's speaker. Graham Odds has been at Scott Logic for 14 years. And over that time, he's been a developer, a user experience designer, and a general thorn in the side of anyone who doesn't like change. During his extensive work on everything from retail investment systems to research and analysis tools and trading systems across banking, energy and public sector, he's built a strong track record of closing the understanding gap between IT and the business. So without any further ado, let me pass you over to Graham.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's a lovely little intro, so I don't have to repeat anything that was covered in there. Cool. So just, I guess, diving straight on in. The thing I want to talk about today is I want to really represent a very non-technical sort of exploration of this thing called APIs, because I think they really need to be understood and embraced by everyone across organizations, not just the technical teams, where they're a bit more comfortable with it. Without that sort of broad understanding of what APIs are, I think organizations tend to struggle to realize the full potential of digital transformation efforts. Now, a lot of projects that are sort of API projects tend to be very short-sighted, and they tend to be driven by sort of technical necessity rather than something more strategic. And they, as a result, they don't tend to unlock some of the sort of broader business benefits and opportunities that I see. And I believe the organizations that aren't able to make this kind of shift are being left behind in this increasingly digital native world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should jump in and start to explain what APIs are. Now, apologies to those who already have deep technical understanding, but I promised non-technical. So these three letters stand for Application Programming Interface. If that's the only thing you learn from today, then great, that's a start. But also just so you understand, these are a very broad technical construct for something that's existed pretty much as long as digital technology has. It's not a new thing. It's not even a hugely specific thing. Ultimately, they're a way of sort of defining how information or functionality or services is provided, really, and it's just a definition. And to help me understand them, I often try and compare them to something I'm much more familiar with, which is user interfaces. And they are conceptually very, very similar. Both of these things, both UIs and APIs, dictate what you can see and do with a digital system. The big difference is who they're for. User interfaces are for humans, you or I, to talk to digital systems, to talk to machines. APIs do exactly the same things, but they let machines talk to machines. They let digital systems interact with digital systems. Other than that, there's lots of really detailed differences, but broadly speaking, the rest is all the same. Now, while they're nothing new, because they're a very technical thing and they tend to be, live very squarely in the technical domain, the result is that they tend not to be understood or not even championed by non-technical people in an organization. And so they often get overlooked despite their huge significance in our world these days. So as a result, the development of APIs tends to be driven by sort of technical necessity rather than a broader strategic intent. And these efforts rarely unlock really what can be provided to the business if we fully embrace it. Now, I'll get to some of that potential in a bit, but before we get there, some of the things I wanted to call out, one of the things I wanted to call out anyway, was that I see a lot of very naive digital transformation efforts through no fault of anyone. It just tends to happen through especially non-technical people just not understanding APIs. So a lot of digital transformation work gets grounded in these sort of unquestioned historical assumptions around people's involvement in all sorts of processes and workflows. So the end result is that sort of, while digital technology gets involved in the new process, it's just a change of sort of medium rather than actual reinvention of the process or the workflow. I'm sure, especially in these lockdown times, you've had situations where someone emails you a form or a contract or something that you have to print out and then sign and then scan and then email back somehow. And it's got this weird sort of dip into the analog world because that's how we've done it of old, rather than embracing the way digital technologies can actually help us do this more efficiently and frankly less painfully these days. I say painfully because I don't even have a printer at home anymore, so it's a particularly difficult one for me. Now, I have to admit, I'm going to say all these things from, say a position of pretty decent digital literacy, and I have to call out that we shouldn't forget those who are not effectively engaging with the digital world. Those numbers are decreasing. We're getting more and more digitally capable people and digitally capable organizations. And this is an awkward balancing act, but I don't think we should use the excuse of the people who are not digitally literate to take a sort of lowest common denominator approach. I think we really should be trying to offer digital services in the best form possible for those people who are digitally literate, and we shouldn't be doing that through sort of ham-fisted UIs when it's potentially a machine that's sitting on the other end. As someone who works with data a lot, I can't tell you how unbelievably frustrating I find it when I get given data tables as like images or PDFs or Excel files. These things are all created under an assumption that it's going to be a human that's going to be reading this information. The reality is I'm after the data and I want to plug it into some tool that I can do some further analysis on. And yes, Excel is okay for that, but there's far more capable things than that. So actually I want it in a form that's sort of easily consumed in a digital form, rather than this sort of old-fashioned pseudo paper form that is images and PDFs and things like that. Now, actually, an API sort of the next step on from your sort of raw data, potentially, because this way I could actually get up-to-date live information rather than just a snapshot of data. But again, we'll get to this in a minute. Now, these APIs, right? Why I think they're so powerful is they can give you that real-time information. They can give you it with a precision and accuracy that no human can actually process. We're just not fast enough or capable enough to read that much information flying through at that kind of speed. Machines and APIs on the other end of them can execute actions at a rate faster than any humans can, and they don't get tired, frankly. Now, they let you shift as a consumer from maybe actively having to seek out if something relevant has happened to being able to just passively consume information when something relevant has happened. So they're really empowering in that sense. And I don't think we should fear or fight these kind of capabilities, right? We shouldn't allow them to be ignored or dismissed just because some people aren't technical and don't understand them and are potentially somewhat intimidated by them. They're not scary, trust me. So I really believe very strongly that effective digital transformation is grounded in really understanding these two superpowers of humans and machines that I've called out here on the slide. They're very different. They can bring real power to any process if used in the right places at the right times. Don't force one in where the other is more suitable. And I'm not the only one that believes this, right? There's loads of success stories out there. I'll just call out a few. Stripe, right? If you never heard of Stripe, this is a company that provides, as they call it, payments infrastructure for the internet. Whether you realize it or not, if you've made a payment online anywhere in the last few years, there's a pretty good chance you have used Stripe. Now, the thing is, Stripe recognizes that payments is this hugely complicated problem. But from an end user's perspective, it's just a really small part of that process. I mean, I just want to hand in my card and get it done. I don't care how complicated it is behind the scenes. And so Stripe bundles up that complexity, and they don't get in the way. They don't impose themselves on me as an end user. They recognize that their APIs are really what they need to be providing for others to integrate and others to create that user-facing experience. Compare that to a PayPal or a WorldPay or a SagePay, where I get redirected into frankly, quite an ugly, horrible experience that takes me out of sometimes a beautiful sort of commercial transaction online. Now, just to be clear, right, Stripe doesn't own that sort of end user interaction. They just provide these payments APIs, but they're currently valued at $36 billion because of how well they do this. Now, a part of how well they do it is because these APIs they provide, they treat them like true first-class citizens. And as a technical consumer, but even as a non-technical consumer, you can delight at their website and the product they present. You can truly understand what they're offering, whether or not you know how to hook up the code to do it. Or if you do know how to hook up the code to do it, there's still a delight to use right down to the very, very bottom of the details in there. So, Stripe's a great example of them just recognizing that APIs is a huge, valuable service. Is a hugely valuable way of providing their services out to other buyers of that service. Now, a completely different example is the world of open banking. Now, if you've not heard about this, in January 2018, the Competition and Markets Authority introduced this initiative as a regulatory driver to increase sort of user-centered competition and innovation in the market. The big banks, frankly, needed their information shared a bit more broadly so that others could get in on it. And this is just a UK thing, but it ties into a broader EU initiative as well. And they wanted to make all this information in the banks available to third-party providers that were all being regulated as well. But they did that through prescribed standardized APIs that all the banks had to implement. Now, I'm going to come back to this specific thing later on, but this has created huge value, and especially during these lockdown times, they have seen the user base of these APIs rocket. They're a new form of getting our information, our banking information out to many, many customers in many different forms for many different uses. Now, the last example I was going to briefly touch on, if you aren't convinced yet, was actually Transport for London. Now, 10 years ago, they decided to make a lot of their non-personal data, so things like timetables, service status, and the like, available for free for anyone to use through their public APIs. And they wanted to do this so they could get new partners onto board who'd produce new products, new services, and get TfL's information out there into the world in and around London, frankly. That was a real success. In 2017, Deloitte undertook an independent review of the economic value and social benefits that resulted from TfL providing these open APIs, and it quantified that this data being released out there and being made available for machines to consume was generating annual economic benefits and savings of up to £130 million, not just for TfL, but for London and for travellers, really rounded benefits that were coming out of this. Now, again, I'm getting very excited by the prospect of APIs. I want to just step back a little bit and take stock about where APIs tend to be. And trust me, they are there in the organizations you work for. They're in use. They're probably being developed. You're probably creating your own, but they tend to sit in that technical realm rather than elevating up into the more strategic. So also just to add on to that, this API, as I've said, is a very, very broad term, right? Covers all sorts of things. In practice, this can be pretty much an API can be, how code talks to the operating system that your machine is, that the code is running on. It can be how a website or a mobile app is talking to a backend database, and everything in between, like lots and lots of different guises the APIs come in. When you hear people talking about integrating sort of system X with system Y, they're typically referring to this act of sort of hooking up APIs of these two systems with one another. And that's actually not that different from how websites or mobile apps talk to their backends. So when I'm talking about APIs, pretty much from this point in, but also a little bit before, I'm talking about these high level sort of system to system APIs, not the nitty gritty, how do you talk to the hardware that it's running on type of APIs. Because I think that high level is more relevant to you. So for those of you who know the technical details, apologies if I'm going some fairly broad strokes on some of this stuff. Now, I'm going to run through 3 categories of APIs that I typically see popping up, just to start to give you an idea of some of these big differences between the different type of APIs you'll come across. Now, internal APIs, as I call them, they really are the most prevalent class of APIs that exist in organizations, because by technical necessity, these things exist anytime any systems are integrated with one another. So they tend to grow and appear pretty organically. There tend to be a lot of them. They tend to be very messy, and they tend to lack any sort of strategic or technical consistency, frankly. They tend to be these really narrow point-to-point connections between specific parts of systems just to fulfill some particular need at a particular point in time. And they tend to be brittle, and they tend to be riddled in assumptions as a result. Now, if we compare this to user interfaces again, which I'm going to keep doing, think of those sort of nasty, often gray screen type of internal user interfaces you've probably been forced to use at some point. APIs like these internal ones, these internal UIs, they can be really sort of esoteric. They can, like, you have to know which magic incantation to use to be able to magically make it work for you. And all of that is just because they really reflect all the sort of idiosyncrasies that exist in the underlying system. So much like those UIs, these internal APIs tend to be like that because they're developed on a shoestring. They're just about getting the job done as quickly as possible. They're rarely created to fantastic standards, and they're often introducing security vulnerabilities, to be honest, and they create knock-on effects in all sorts of places because they're produced in such a narrow, with such narrow assumptions around them. They tend not to be documented. They're hard, trust me, they're hard to find, and then let alone they're hard to unpick and figure out what the hell's going on if you can find them. And they're often not recognized as actually being services, which they are. Other things are dependent on them. And so they tend to be maintained as these sort of reluctant side of desk activities, and people get very frustrated with them, understandably so. So that's internal APIs, and I've painted a beautiful picture of those, no doubt. Now, I talk about partner APIs as well, and these often tend to evolve from these internal APIs because they're sort of exposed to a number of known sort of external consumers, sometimes third parties, sometimes other parts within the same organization. Now, these type of APIs tend to be built a little bit more sort of system to system to connect rather than point to point, but they still tend to be developed with a deep understanding of what's happening on both sides, and deep assumptions about how everything's going to work. Think of those sort of line of business tools that you've had to use when we're comparing thinking in terms of user interfaces. They're nowhere near the websites or apps you use where, as a consumer, as a Joe Public, when you grab your phone and you're doing something for your own personal life. These partner tools, partner UI, partner APIs tend to be fine, and it's hard to say much more than they are fine. They tend to be built around there is some kind of commercial or contractual agreement between two parties involved in a partner API, but they have little more than that. It tends to be a one-off transaction that's occurred there. So some documentation will have been created at some point once when the integration first happened. It's probably not up to date. And change tends to be rarely forthcoming in these types of APIs. Now, I contrast that with public APIs, this third category I'm going to classify. Now, these tend to be publicly available, as the name suggests. They could be commercial, so they could be paid for, or they could be free, and they tend to be used for third parties. So all those examples I mentioned before about Stripe and open banking and Transport for London, they're all public APIs by my categorization. So by their very nature, they are recognized as services that your organization is providing to the public. And so you can find documentation, you can discover what they are, you can discover how they work. And that's the same as a publicly facing app or a website or whatever. You can find them, right? And they tend to get the care and attention that they warrant. Now, these public APIs also try to create a very what I call an easy interface for the consuming systems, in both in terms of the technical details, but in the domain as well, right? They tend to hide away all those idiosyncrasies that might exist in underlying systems, and they tend to use common technologies, things that other people are used to using or tend to be widespread. That's why a lot of these APIs are available over the web rather than through other odd protocols. And ultimately, this is because if you're creating a public service, you want it to be sort of universal and accessible and for all, not not just some the magic person that knows how to connect into you. Another side effect of all of this is because you're throwing it out sort of into the wild, they tend to be developed with a sort of defensive mindset. So you don't make assumptions about the systems that are going to be connecting into your service. You basically try and build a service that is going to handle overuse or misuse or abuse. Any of these things could be intentional or otherwise, but you try and defend against that in sensible ways. Again, like consumer websites and apps, this comparison holds up, right? So think about that email client you use. When was the last time you had to worry about what happens under the covers? I mean, it just kind of works, right? Last time you went onto your online banking, it had two-factor authentication, I suspect. You didn't feel like this was some nasty, dirty thing that you could just sort of walk into and ask questions about, which is what happens if you just have internal APIs and these partner APIs where lots of these assumptions and defensiveness starts to erode and disappear. So, I painted a picture of these different classes, and I want to focus here on, that's how things tend to be, but how can we do them what I would call properly? How can I do them well? And I should add, a lot of these benefits of good APIs I'm going to talk about only hold if you do these things well. These sort of quick and dirty, nasty, short-term thinking in some of these internal APIs don't give you these benefits. And that's why you need to understand how to do these things well to get the benefits out of it. And I will get to those benefits, trust me. What I should say about APIs is they tend to be very technical. I mentioned that before. And they tend to be started from a technical perspective. But actually, if you think of them as a product or a service, you probably want to adopt a more user-centered mindset. You want to start from the perspective of the consumer of this system and start to establish a vision for what the API might look like, what you're trying to achieve for people. And then afterwards, you can worry about how you're going to deliver that within whatever constraints you've got on your service or system. So of those previous three classes I was talking about, the public API is sort of the blueprint to follow regardless of which of those classes you fall into. Now, you might roll back from that and you might have a slightly cheaper and cheerfuler version of what you might do for a public API if it's just for internal consumption, but you should still aspire towards that sort of public API blueprint. So from an API, if we think about an API from a consumer's point of view, you quickly realize there's lots of different users and they've got lots of different needs and everything, it's a hard world to map. Fortunately, there are plenty of service designers, user experience designers out there who can help you navigate this world. You'll start to recognize that really what we're trying to do is you're trying to create something that's accessible both in technical and domain terms. And again, here you can lean on this sort of notion that what you know about user interfaces, right? Good user interfaces, and the same holds for good APIs, they provide this sort of intuitive experience and they just help you do what you're trying to do. Really poor ones require you to sort of battle the API or the user interface and you feel like you're just constantly fighting with the damn thing. Now, similarly, again, with both UIs and APIs, there are patterns and conventions that users are familiar with. Deviating from those tends to cause frustration and confusion. So you can roll back and look at standards and get a good handle on probably what you should be trying to do. Now, if we again just slice a bit further than that broad view I've given there, there's common needs around robustness and security and reliability, but I wanted to call out here a few generic other perspectives to take into account. We often think about developers when it comes to APIs because they are the most obvious users of APIs. They want to be able to find the service, they want to be able to evaluate it, they want to know how to connect to it and how to test what they're building against it. Well, try and meet all those needs for the external developers. From an operational point of view, well, you know what? When you've got a system that's hooked into some API, you've got operational dependency there. So you want to know the status of that API and potentially all sorts of associated operational metrics. So, is the service down? When was the data last updated? What's the status of the downstream services that you're providing access to? All those things should be surfaced for the more operational perspective. Now, I call out systems as one of the users, right? Other machines consume this. They're not humans, but they are users of these APIs. And I talked earlier about their sort of superpower around speed and precision. Well, you need to embrace that where possible as well. And this often comes at conflict with some of the developers' wants and needs. But a system wants as few technical overheads as possible to be able to exploit that speed and precision. Furthermore, that sort of mode of interaction for the system should match the service's intention. So if you're creating if you're sharing real-time information, push it to the consuming system. Don't wait and expect the consuming system to constantly ask, is the new information, is the new information, is the new information, because it gets very old and tiresome for that consuming system. But there's more you can explore there. And then I also call out non-technical users, which tend to be forgotten. And I think that's why a lot of us get alienated from this world of APIs. Business analysts, designers, product managers, all those kinds of people, they play these critical roles in shaping products and services that your APIs potentially want to underpin or enhance. So they need to be able to find your services and your API and evaluate them and understand the services you provide, but they're not technical. They're not going to look through detailed technical API documentation. So give them something to consume as well. Now, all these things together potentially give you a view of what you're trying to produce from a consumer's point of view, but you also then need to think about you as the producer. Now, you need to think about the long-term viability and maintainability of these services, right? Fortunately, lots of your concerns align really well with what good looks like from the consumer's point of view. So, you want a well-rounded view of robustness and security and things like that. You want fault tolerance, you want resilience, you want to get rid of assumptions, all great things. And that's what consumers want as well. But also in the longer term, as the producer, you want to worry about how expandable they are, how maintainable they are, making sure that they're really loosely coupled from the sort of underlying bits and gubbins for how it's been implemented, so that you can change things on the fly or over time as you change directions or improve things or enhance things. So if you don't think about those things from a more strategic point of view, then an API, like any service, is going to age and wither pretty gracelessly. And it'll add to your technical debt, and it'll add all sorts of nasty into your digital estate. And I should point out, many of these sort of internal requirements tend not to be easy to tackle in sort of like isolated cases. It tends not to be one API you worry about. They tend to be a broader thing. If you start to think about these in more strategic terms, then you start to create tooling and support for making it easier and faster and better to create better quality APIs. You tend to get rid of a lot of the technical distractions because you give them to the teams for free, effectively. Automated tooling around provisioning of URLs, firewalls, deployments, all that kind of stuff, automatic generation of documentation or automatic testing and versioning of APIs, all these things help your projects focus on the actual core value of your API rather than worrying about all the other bits and pieces, all the technical hurdles that you have to tackle if you do it one by one by one. Now, I'm really conscious that what I'm saying here sounds really onerous and requires a lot of effort. Now, I think it is worth it, for starters, I should say. But most importantly, what I would say is anchor your efforts in that blueprint of the public APIs. Aim for the really awesome, and then roll back from it in appropriate places. You don't have to make something discoverable by having the glossiest, shiniest, most branded, beautiful public documentation ever. But it's useful to have some kind of register of what APIs are available, where you can find them in some common, obvious place. That's pretty cheap and easy to do. Some of these automated tools don't have to be beautiful either. There can be a bit of manual wrangling that has to go in there, but it does help accelerate the efforts around it. So it's really important to think about that from the strategic point of view. Now, we mentioned earlier that Happy Hour, we're doing this all this week, and some of these concerns around sort of the strategically how you try and tackle an API are going to be covered off in more detail by a colleague of mine, I think on Thursday. If you want to dig more into that, I strongly recommend you attend his session. I'm going to finally get on to starting to scratch the surface of these benefits of doing APIs properly, because there's lots of different things to it. Now, I first call out, I'm going to reiterate this, okay? APIs, if you create them just because of technical necessity, they will tie you down. They will make your life miserable, and they will start to play your hand for you in all sorts of ways. You'll end up trying to unpick this sort of tangled mess of integrations everywhere, and they will just become more and more of a burden for you. If you use APIs to their full potential, they start to free you. They start to give you so many opportunities. You start to be able to focus on what you're trying to do with your organization. You start to be able to keep pace with ever increasing customer expectations. And you start to be able to actually deliver on value for your customers and your users and the people you're trying to service. So one of the things I'd call out here, one of the huge benefits of APIs done properly is about providing business agility and accelerating innovation. Now, if you treat these APIs like the first-class citizens I've tried to encourage you to do, then you stop creating and deploying and implementing these massive monolithic single-use pieces of software. You start to move towards a more modular approach where there's lots of reuse. I tend to try and compare this to using Lego blocks rather than maybe some die-cast model. If you bought this beautiful, I don't know, sculpture of Statue of Liberty, let's go for, great. At that point in time, got this beautiful little statue. What if I change my mind? What if I want something different? What do you start sort of gaffer taping something onto the side? I mean, it immediately becomes hideous, and it's probably not going to stay on there very well. But if I had a Lego model of that Statue of Liberty, well, it might not be as beautiful when you're right up close, but from far away, it looks almost identical. But when we start to want to change things, it becomes fairly freeform and easy. We can start to change direction when we want to, rather than having to throw the whole old thing out. We start to be able to actually give confidence to our business in terms of agility. It's like, no longer does IT have to say to the business, no, sorry, we can't do that. It's too hard, or it's going to take too long. We can actually make these small adjustments and tweaks as we go along. And the more of these sort of proper APIs that you create across your organization, the faster and easier it becomes to try new things or to change things. You can create new products, start to develop new features by being bootstrapped by all these existing APIs that actually work for you rather than against you. You start to break down silos, frankly, when silos come into play so often here with the way historically software has been developed, where these big monoliths, and unless you're in that part of the organization, good luck trying to get into their technology platform as well. It lets you break that down, lets you start to focus your energy on actually testing and validating what you're proposing to put out there to the market. Now, an example of this with one of Scott Logic's clients is a company called Fast Markets. Now they provide sort of trusted data to the commodities market. So they provide index prices for all sorts of metals and timbers and all sorts of other things. And they had 5 or 6 different sub brands and different platforms, all providing different segments of the data in all sorts of ways. And they've spent a couple of years re-engineering their entire platform, consolidating it into one cloud-native platform that creates this beautiful API onto the data. Now, Scott Logic has had no involvement in that part, right? They have done this incredible job, and I really recommend you go and check this out. Where we have been helping them is about building some of the pieces on top of that. So the sort of dashboard platform that's mentioned here, we help them design and build out a user interface that could let users actually explore the information in all sorts of bespoke, personalized ways. But on top of that, we also built a small mobile app in 6 weeks. We actually prototyped the whole thing, pitched it to Fast Markets, and built it in that space of time. Because we knew the API was fantastic. We knew we could just build new things on there. And you know what? If they decided the mobile app's no longer for them, they can throw it away and nothing is lost. Or if they wanted to change the APIs, the mobile app's probably just going to cope with it because it's this lightweight little beast that's sitting on top of these lovely APIs. So they see real value in that and lets them change these things as they go along. The Excel add-in that's come in there, I was not even aware of that until a few weeks ago, and so it advertised on their website. Again, just built on top of existing APIs. They've not done anything new there. It's just a new offering they're able to go out with because they've got these building blocks in place. Now, another big benefit of APIs, when they're done properly, is that you can make sure that you hide things away from those on the other side. That sounds like the opposite of what you want to do in terms of openness and honesty, but often the systems we have under the covers are pretty nasty, frankly. There are all these legacy details hiding in there and these esoteric natures, but the issue with APIs not done properly is we tend to project those onto the consuming systems. So everything that interacts with this old piece or potentially new piece of technology that we've just bought in has to know how to interact with that. And you sort of get this stalemate lock-in type of situation. Now, APIs done properly abstract your choices behind the scenes away from the consumer. So you start to be able to create a more agile, a more sort of incremental strategy. You can actually change your mind. You can not lock yourself into a technology, or you can, but only within a certain, well, nicely contained space, rather than letting that bleed on into all sorts of other places. That sounds like an interesting, but it actually goes further. If you do this, then actually the decisions you need to make become smaller, and they could happen in isolation. Too often I see organizations sort of stuck with legacy, and it's not in technical terms that they're stuck. What they're stuck with is making choices, because the consequences are so big, the knock-on effects are so big, that trying to get your head around making a decision is extremely hard. So APIs done properly, they contain that. They make those problems smaller, which makes it easier to start to make those decisions and not have to worry about all these sorts of knock-on effects. It gives you an ability to actually sweat those legacy assets for even longer if you really, really want to, because you can start to build new things on top. Now, one of the clients I was going to talk about in this context was actually the Department for Work and Pensions, and some of the great work that they're doing there. But I realized just the other day that Jackie Legator, is talking about the area of work that we're involved with, I believe, on Wednesday. So if you're interested in how to get more out of some of your systems with APIs, she's going to hopefully do a fantastic case study about that on Wednesday. So I'm going to talk about briefly about Newcastle Strategic Solutions, who we work with. This is part of Newcastle Building Society, if the colours vaguely ring a bell with you. Now, we help them build out this sort of strategic API layer on top of some of their legacy systems, so that they could start to actually service their customers more directly. So we help them with that API layer. And again, a little bit like the fast markets thing, this helped us build a mobile app like this, which is a white labeled piece that works actually across Newcastle Building Society and a whole bunch of other brands, built on top of the same legacy platform. They're now actually able to get so much more out of those legacy systems because of this nice API layer we've put on top. And these new shiny bits of tech like the mobile app are not tied in to those legacy systems at all. They're tied in to very neat, neutral APIs. The last benefit I was going to call out is one about focusing your efforts. And for me, this is a really important one. I see so many organizations trying to be all things to their customers. They sit there going, oh crap, right, so we have this service, we have a system, we need to have the database and the information, and we need to worry about the UI, and we need to worry about everything in between, and we need to have the customer service and the support and the this and the that and the this and the that, and it builds up and it builds up. Now, that's a lot of areas to build up expertise around. And it's very, very hard as sort of digital expectations and customer expectations accelerate at huge pace. So maybe don't try and keep up with all of that. Right? APIs potentially give you a way of focusing on just the part that you're good at. Maybe it's just the information or just some transactional services that you make available through APIs to third parties, to other producers of people who worry about that interface with the customers. Maybe you can effectively outsource that problem to them. It requires a significant shift in organizational mindset, but the rewards really can be vast. I mean, Stripe was a great example of that. And I mentioned open banking. Open banking is actually another example of this. So, we've worked for quite a number of years with NatWest Group in a whole host of areas, but also within their open banking program. Now, over the space of the last few years, they, like many other of the big banks, went from a position of sort of, well, being very reluctant about having to oblige to these regulations and having to live up to them, to now actually loving what they've done. They've gone from having no public APIs and sitting there rooting around internally going, well, we've got hundreds of things that do sort of the same thing in different ways, but it's all a bit yucky, to now having actually really elegant APIs that are serving tens of millions of hits every month, and they are integrating into hundreds of third-party providers. And they love it. This is providing whole new routes to market for them that they'd previously never considered. In fact, they're going well beyond just the open banking APIs that they have to provide. They're now creating new commercialized APIs in the same vein. They've gone as an organization from lots of different silos, frankly, having to root out where they might find customer information, for example, to now internally consuming their own open APIs because they're the neatest, nicest way to interact with their information without having to know that I have to look at in systems X, Y, and Z depending on these attributes of the customer. It's all just hidden from them because it creates this beautiful, elegant API on top. And it's opening up a whole new world for them and a whole new route of set of business models that they possibly previously never considered. Now, just to summarize what we've touched on here, right? First of all, I talked about what APIs are. And in this phrase, let machines talk to machines, that's me trying to really make this point that APIs have a real place from a business point of view. And don't forget that. Dig in, understand them better. I give you a bit of an overview of what I believe the current typical state of play in most organizations is, because that's what we're going to try and build on and move on from. I gave you a view of what I think an API done well looks like. So in the vision of where you should try and move the typical state towards. And I called out some of these benefits of what I think of as proper APIs, which hopefully help you convince you that this is really, really worthwhile doing. Now, I started out really enthusiastic about APIs. Hopefully some of this enthusiasm has rubbed off on you. If you want to talk more about this at any point, I'm always happy to have a chat about these things. And many other aspects of innovation, but this is just one. And with that, I will say thank you and leave it there.